And welcome back to the Osteo and Physio YouTube channel. For today's video, we are going to be running through why am I getting pain at the back of my pelvis. So number one of the most common conditions that we see in clinic is something called sacroiliac joint dysfunction or capsulitis. So it's when we get dysfunctional pain around your sacroiliac joint, which is at the back of the pelvis. This joint is absolutely key for creating the pelvic girdle and stability, but also absolutely vital when we're walking and moving day to day. For example, seated to standing, running, whatever we're doing, we need that joint to function to help us move. The reasons why it is very common to get pain around this area is a lot of people might have possibly trauma into the pelvis. We might find and see lots of pregnant women as they're going into their third trimester, as we're changing the mechanics of the pelvis and we're twisting and rotating. Sometimes you can get patterns where it puts a lot of pressure into this joint. You might get it with a picking up injury, because again, when you're rotating forward, you can get it where the joint locks into a position and causes pain over that area. When we get injury through repetitive movements, through trauma or potentially pregnancy, as mentioned before, we can get torsional patterns through the pelvis and therefore different injuries over the sacroiliac joints. What we typically find in clinic, if one side is locked up or hypomobile or restricted, we typically get the opposite in the opposite side. So what we would look at is when someone's coming into clinic, we'd want to work out, okay, where is the pain? Typically it's local over the joint, so they tend to point onto the joint, but what can also happen due to pain around the capsule, around the joint, is that you can get referred pain. So although it gives local pain around the back, they can get tenderness and soreness into the glutes, into the back of the hamstrings, and sometimes round the front into the front of the quad as well, due to the innervation of that capsule. It's normally made worse for weight bearing or walking or transitional movements, and it's normally relieved when they're either lying on their back or not using or loading through that side. What we would look at as osteopaths is how is the whole pelvis moving. We'd also want to look at hip movement as well to see how that might be impacting, as well as the surrounding muscles that attach and blend around that area, for example glute max, median min and the piriformis muscle, and how that might be impacting their prognosis. Number two, very much coinciding with sacroiliac joint capsulitis, we can have something called myalgia or trigger points into the surrounding pelvic muscles. A couple of different reasons for this. If we've had any repetitive movements or abnormal patterns through the lower body, i.e. they've been twisting or lifting awkwardly and they've been loading through these muscles, if we're not stretching and relaxing them after doing physical activity or day-to-day activity, they can start to tighten and fatigue through that area. What can happen within the belly of the muscle is you can get something called trigger points. It's part of the muscle that hasn't fully relaxed, so it's still in a contraction, and what most people find when they come in is it's very pinpoint over one of the parts of the muscle. So it's either in the belly of the muscle or near to the attachment onto the bone. We find it's very, very tender, so it's normally okay when they're using, getting blood to the muscle, so when they're actually walking it seems relatively okay, but they normally find at the end of the day where they've been using that muscle that is fatigued and contracted, it becomes very, very sore, very achy. What's really key with the trigger points is it can, yes, give local pain around the back of the pelvis like we're talking about today, but similar to other pain pattern referrals, that trigger point can go from latent to active, and when a trigger point becomes active, it has very, very specific pain patterns or patterns of pain associated with it. So someone might be having local pain that's also referring to other areas. So what we would look at as osteopaths, obviously palpate around, work out what's going on and where they're feeling the trigger point. We would release into that area to release that tightness, and again, same with the sacroiliac joint capsulitis or injury, we'd want to get the whole area moving from the lumbar spine, pelvis, obviously hips and lower extremity. Finally, another common condition that we see in clinic referring around the back of the pelvis actually is coming from the lumbar spine. So as we look into the lumbar spine, when we get the joints right at the base of the spine, so L5-S1, we've got facet joints either side that help rotate, bend and flex the spine. What can happen, similar to the sacroiliac joint, is if that facet joint's either locked into a position, or there's inflammation, or it's become into dysfunction, i.e. from long-term wear and tear, and it's causing unilateral pinpoint pain higher into the lumbar spine. Sometimes if that continues to inflame or become aggravated, its capsular pattern or pain pattern can actually refer into the back of the pelvis. How we would differentiate this from sacroiliac joint capsulitis or trigger point referral is we'd want to assess and move through the lower back. So we'd want to see if we're loading through the facet joints in the lumbar spine, does that trigger the pain? Does that individual find when they're moving the spine that it makes the pain worse? Any position that relieves it, i.e. if they're moving where it's restricted, i.e. where it's stuck and where it's being held, does that make it easier? Because of course you think going the opposite way to where it's fixed in a pattern, of course will be uncomfortable, because the body's quite comfortable into that rotational flexion position. So this is what we would look for, and same with treatment with the other conditions. We want to get the lower back moving. We'd want to relax any guarding around the postural muscles in the lower back that might be holding that pattern, and of course looking at the pelvis and the hips and how they're moving, and how this might be either predisposing or aggravating pain into the joints of the lower back.